On a white-hot afternoon in the summer of 1852, Silas Webb called every soul on Hollow Grove Plantation into the yard between the big house and the quarters. He did it the way he did most things that mattered to him, without warning, without mercy, and without the slightest concern for who might be watching. The Kentucky sun sat directly overhead, flattening every shadow into a thin dark line. The tobacco fields beyond the fence rippled green and endless in every direction, as if the whole world had been sewn from the same cloth. Jessamine County in those years was the beating heart of what men called the bluegrass, ground so rich and dark it seemed to swallow the light. Silas Webb had built his fortune on 1,200 acres of it, and on the backs of the 89 people he claimed to own. Silas was 51 years old that summer, thick through the shoulders and going soft in the belly, with mutton chop whiskers gone gray at the edges and pale eyes the color of creek water in winter. He had married twice, buried one wife, and built a house with white columns that could be seen from the county road a mile off. The house was meant to announce to anyone passing that here lived a man of consequence. On that afternoon, standing on the bottom step of his own front porch, with his thumbs hooked into his waistcoat, he intended to make an announcement that had been building in him for 22 years. "Bring my daughter out," he said. The words fell into the yard like a stone into still water. There was a silence that lasted too long. Then came the creak of wheels over hard-packed dirt. Delia, the house servant who had cared for Theodora Webb since the day she was born, pushed the wheeled chair around the side of the house and into the sun. Theodora sat with her spine straight as a fence post, her hands folded in her lap, her dark hair pinned back so severely that not a strand dared move in the small hot wind. She was 22 years old, and her legs had never once carried her a single step in her life. The chair itself was crude, built of ashwood by a plantation carpenter a decade earlier, its iron-rimmed wheels groaning with every turn. Theodora occupied it the way a queen occupies a throne she never asked for and had long since stopped resenting. Resentment, she had learned, was a luxury reserved for people whose suffering someone still cared to notice. Doctors from as far as Louisville and Lexington had examined her as a child, and none of them could explain why her legs had simply never obeyed her. Her mother, Cordelia Webb, had died in the birthing bed, hemorrhaging until there was nothing left to save. Silas had never said aloud what he believed in the darkest part of himself, that his wife's life had been spent to purchase a daughter who could not even stand. But he thought it every single day, and the thought had curdled inside him for 2 decades until it hardened into something closer to disgust than grief. "This girl," Silas said, gesturing at Theodora the way a man gestures at a mule he is done arguing with, "has cost me 22 years of doctors and nursemaids and chairs and patience. She will not marry. No man of standing in this county will have her, and I have stopped pretending otherwise. I am done carrying that weight." Theodora did not flinch. Behind her, Delia's knuckles went pale, where she gripped the chair's handles. Somewhere in the crowd, a child began to cry and was hushed immediately. "Solomon," Silas called. The man who stepped forward from the cluster of field hands was not a man anyone in that yard could pretend not to notice. He stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, a height that, in those years, bordered on the impossible. 15 years of unbroken labor had built him into something the overseers liked to show off to visiting planters as proof of what Hollow Grove's soil and discipline could produce in a man. His shoulders were wide as a doorframe, his forearms roped with muscle from years at the tobacco scales and the timber saw. His face gave away nothing. High cheekbones, a jaw set like poured iron, eyes so dark, and still that very few people claim to have ever read anything in them. He had been brought to Hollow Grove at 13 years old, purchased off a coffle out of Richmond, along with 4 other boys. In the years since, no one on the place had ever heard him complain or beg or weep. That silence made him more dangerous in Jared Combs's eyes and more of a mystery in everyone else's. "You are the strongest hand I own," Silas told him. "The most useful. I have given you privileges other men here do not get, and now I am going to give you something more." Solomon waited, his expression unmoved. "I am giving you this woman. She is yours now. Feed her, carry her, do with her whatever you please. She is no longer my concern." The whole yard held its breath. Nobody spoke. The enslaved men and women stared at the ground. The few white hands exchanged uneasy glances. Jared Combs, the overseer, stood near the west corner of the porch with his hat pushed back, and something like pleasure moved across his thin mouth. The particular pleasure of a small man watching someone else be made smaller. Theodora, for the first time in the whole scene, turned her head toward her father. Just for a moment. Just long enough to look at him with eyes that were not crying, because Theodora Webb had not cried in front of another living soul since she was 9 years old. She had learned instead to simply record what was done to her, to file it away in some cold locked room in her chest, and to bury the person who had done it a little deeper each time. Then she faced forward again toward the fields, toward nothing in particular. Solomon looked at her. She looked at him. Neither said a word. "Everyone is dismissed," Silas said, and turned back toward the house without waiting to see what happened next. To him, nothing that happened next could possibly matter. What happened after was not what anyone in that yard expected. Solomon did not seize her. He did not carry her off against her will. He did not speak a single word about ownership or rights. Once the yard had emptied, and only the 2 of them remained, Theodora in her chair, Delia hovering a few feet back with her hands twisting in her apron, Solomon standing a careful distance away. It was he who spoke first. He did it quietly with the same enormous calm he seemed to carry into everything. "Where do you want to go?" Theodora looked at him as though the question might be a trap. "What do you mean? Where do I want to go?" "To the women's quarters, I suppose. Wherever you are told to put me." "I asked you." "Not him." Delia looked at Solomon with something between confusion and what might have been gratitude, if she had not still been so frightened. Theodora took a long moment to answer. She was not a woman who usually needed time. Her answers came fast and sharp, honed over years into the only weapon a woman in her position was permitted to carry. But this question unsettled her, because no one had ever asked it of her so plainly, without pity and without mockery folded into it. "Put me wherever suits you," she said finally, her voice flat. "I do not have choices." "You do," Solomon said. "There is always something to choose, even inside what you are given." That night, Theodora slept in a small room beside the mule stalls that Solomon had swept clean himself before dark fell. He packed the dirt floor smooth, laid out a fresh corn shuck mattress he had bartered from old Amos, and set a stub of tallow candle on a rough shelf he had nailed to the wall that same afternoon. It was nothing. It was everything he had. Solomon himself slept outside on the narrow porch overhang as he had always done, without anyone asking him to. Delia, curled in the corner of that same small room, stayed awake until first light. She listened to Theodora's breathing, shallow and tense for hours, and then, sometime near 4 in the morning, it finally deepened into real sleep. The child she had raised from a squalling infant had fallen asleep in the worst place of her whole life, and yet she was still breathing steady and even. That, Delia told herself, was something to hold on to. What Delia did not know, what almost no one on Hollow Grove would come to understand for a long while yet, was what moved through Theodora's mind as she lay with her eyes open, in that darkness before sleep finally took her. She was not thinking of her father, or of the public humiliation, or of the uncertain shape of whatever came next. She was thinking about the question, where do you want to go? So plain, so impossibly plain, and so devastatingly unlike anything anyone had ever said to her before in her whole life. Solomon, the name he answered to on Hollow Grove's rolls, though few people bothered to wonder whether it was the only name he had ever carried, or simply the one that had been assigned to him the day he arrived. He was a man whose full history no one on the place actually knew. The other enslaved men and women saw what was visible, the hand who never faltered, who finished his own row, and then quietly moved down to help finish someone else's. The overseers saw what mattered to them, a body worth more than 2 ordinary men, and therefore a body worth protecting from being broken too badly. Silas saw an investment that paid steady dividends. No one saw that Solomon could read. He had learned it from a traveling tutor, a gaunt, gentle Methodist circuit rider named Brother Ephraim Loomis, who had passed through Hollow Grove for 3 months, when Solomon was 16. Brother Loomis was ostensibly there to instruct Silas's late first wife's younger cousins. In the stolen half hours of the midday rest, he taught the letters to a tall, silent boy who kept appearing at the edge of the cane brake, with a hunger in his eyes that Brother Loomis found impossible to ignore, law or no law. Brother Loomis moved on eventually, as traveling men do, but the alphabet stayed lodged in Solomon's mind like a key with no lock he yet understood. Over the years since, he had taught himself to read in scraps, a torn page of an almanac blown into the fence line, a discarded bill of sale left crumpled in the tool shed, a single loose page of a novel someone in the big house had thrown out with the kitchen rubbish. He read slowly, piecing meaning together with the patience that came from having nothing but patience to spend. He understood more than a single soul on that plantation would ever have guessed. The first days between Theodora and Solomon were strange and taut, like a fiddle string tune just short of snapping. She moved through the cramped space of her new world with the practiced efficiency of a lifetime spent learning angles and distances that had never been built with her in mind. She hated being carried, and she made that clear from the very first hour. The first time Solomon reached to help her over a rough step, she said, "Do not touch me without asking." She did not raise her voice. She did not look at him with hatred. She simply stated a fact the way one states the weather. Solomon stopped his hand midair. Understood, he said. If I need to help, I will say so myself. And if I do not say so, I do not need it, even if it looks like I do. Understood. She watched him then, waiting for the sarcasm, the condescension, the impatience she had come to expect from nearly everyone who had ever looked at her. She found none of it. What she found instead was something she could not yet name. Simply attention. The particular kind of attention a person pays to something that matters. The other enslaved people watched her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. To them, Theodora had always been a creature from the other world. The master's daughter, house blood, even if her body had never once been allowed to enjoy the privileges that blood usually bought. Now that she lived beside the stables, nobody quite knew how to treat her. Nobody knew whether she deserved the deference owed to a mistress or the wariness owed to trouble. Amaze, the oldest man on Hollow Grove, a thin, weary soul of perhaps 60 with hair gone entirely white and eyes that always seemed to be looking at something a great distance off, was the first to speak to her plainly. He came by one evening carrying a tin cup of Pimmin beer and set it on her shelf without bowing or lowering his eyes. "Gets cold in here at night," he said. "Colder than it looks in the daytime." Theodora glanced at the cup, then at him. "I know it. There are extra blankets in the back room by the tack. Solomon does not know they are there, because nobody has told him. And now I am telling you." Amos considered her a moment with those distant eyes. "Because I get cold, too," he said, and left. It was the beginning of something Theodora had not expected. Not warmth exactly, not welcome, but something more complicated and more honest. The quiet acceptance of people who already carried more sorrow than they had room for, and who found they had none left over to waste, despising her. It was the 8th night when Theodora discovered it. Solomon believed himself alone. He had lit a stub of candle in the darkest corner of the porch and held in his hands what looked from a distance like a folded scrap of cloth. As Theodora wheeled herself carefully closer over the uneven boards, taking advantage of the fact that his back was turned, she saw that it was several sheets of paper folded and stitched together with coarse thread. Something between a notebook and a letter. His lips moved faintly as he read. His brow drawn in a concentration Theodora recognized instantly, because it was the same expression she wore herself over the pages of a book. She stopped 2 yards away. Solomon felt her presence, looked up, and did not do what she expected. He did not hide the paper, did not scramble to his feet, did not deny anything. He simply looked at her, with those eyes that gave nothing away, and waited. "What are you reading?" she asked. A silence. "A pamphlet," he said finally. "About what?" Another briefer pause. "Natural rights. Whether men are born free or not." Theodora looked at him for a long moment. "And what does it say?" "It says yes," Solomon answered. "That any other condition is something men invented for other men." "And what do you believe?" Solomon lowered the paper. He looked at her with something that was not exactly hardness, but a kind of frankness that burned a little. "I believe the man who wrote that was never enslaved himself," he said. "But I believe he was right anyway." Theodora nodded slowly, then extended her hand. "Pass me the pages when you are finished." Solomon looked at her, then at the outstretched hand, then back at her face. I have been reading since I was 7, Theodora said. My mother taught me before she died. My father never knew because he never cared to ask. For the first time since Theodora had known him, something shifted in Solomon's expression. Not quite a smile, but the look of a man who finds in the last place on earth. He expected it, a window opening onto a landscape he recognizes. He handed her the pages. What began as a small exchange of paper and ink slowly turned, without either of them naming it or deciding it consciously, into something else entirely. Theodora had her own books. The handful she had managed to save from the big house, hidden at the bottom of a wooden trunk that Delia had carried over on the day of her removal. In the evenings they read separately, and then gradually began to speak in low voices about what they found. A phrase that startled one of them, an argument that seemed wrong, an idea that opened onto another idea. Amaze watched them from a distance and said nothing. Delia watched them from closer, and said nothing either, though when she returned to the little room at night, her face carried an expression that was not quite relief, but something more complicated. The look of someone watching a wound that might not fester after all, that might, against every likelihood, begin to close. What no one saw, or what no one wanted to see, was Jared Combs watching all of it. The overseer was 43 years old, and had spent 11 of those years running the daily business of Hollow Grove. In that time, he had built a small, mean architecture of power over the people who worked its fields. He skimmed grain from the corn crib and blamed the shortfall on rats. He played favorites among the field hands in exchange for silence and punished those who displeased him with a severity that went well beyond what discipline required. Jared Combs was a man who needed other men beneath him to feel that he stood above anything at all. Solomon, simply by existing, denied him that feeling every single day. Solomon was stronger, quieter, more respected among the enslaved people than Combs would ever be among anyone. The fact that Silas Webb had, in Combs's mind, rewarded him publicly by handing over his own daughter, filled the overseer with a slow, patient fury that knew how to wait. He had been watching for 3 weeks, counting the nights Solomon's candle burned longer than it should, building something. The trouble did not arrive all at once. Real trouble rarely does. It arrives the way water seeps through a crack in a foundation. First a dampness, then a stain, then the stone giving way beneath it. The first crack was a whisper that Solomon had been seen near the tool shed at an hour he had no business being there. The second was the disappearance of a small, strong box of silver coin from the plantation's counting room. A modest sum, but enough to make noise. The third was Combs's voice, low and reasonable, at Silas Webb's ear, laying out the facts as though they were self-evident. The boy Solomon, sir. He was seen. Silas barely looked up from his ledgers. Proof. 2 men's words. Sir. Which men? Combs named 2 field hands who owed him favors, and who had learned the hard way that refusing the overseer something was more dangerous than lying for him once. Silas closed his account book and looked out the window toward the yard, where Solomon was at that moment crossing with 2 timber beams across his shoulders that would have driven any other man to his knees. That fellow is worth a great deal of money, Silas said with the same indifference he might have used to discuss a plow horse. I do not want him broken too badly. Just enough that he remembers who runs this place. Combs smiled inwardly. As you say, sir. That evening Theodora knew nothing of any of this. She sat beside her candle with a volume of poetry open on her lap, listening to the ordinary sounds of the fields settling into night. The distant lowing of cattle, the wind moving through the row of chinaberry trees someone had planted along the north fence years before. Then Solomon's voice from 2 yards away, where he sat reading in silence, suddenly broke that silence. Your father is going to try something. Theodora looked up. What? I do not know exactly what, but Combs was at the big house twice today. And when Combs goes to the big house, somebody ends up in the stocks by morning. Theodora narrowed her eyes at him. How do you know that? Because I have been here 15 years. A silence. And what are you going to do? She asked. Solomon took a long moment to answer. When he finally did, his voice carried something Theodora had never heard from him before. Not fear exactly, but the exact sober awareness of danger. Whatever I can, he said. Theodora closed her book. She sat still a moment with her hands resting on its worn leather cover, watching the candle flame as though she were working out some private calculation. So will I, she said. Solomon looked at her. You do not have to be part of this. I already am part of it, Theodora said in a voice that admitted no argument. I was made part of it 3 weeks ago in that yard in front of everyone. So yes, I do. What Theodora did not tell him that night was what she had been turning over in her mind for days, slowly and almost involuntarily. The way a person works out a problem of geometry while their hands are busy with something else entirely. Solomon was the first human being in 22 years who had treated her words, her decisions, and her presence as though they mattered. Not out of pity, not out of some obligation of blood, but simply because that was how he treated anything he judged worth his attention. Theodora Webb, who had learned as a child to need no one in order to survive, was beginning to discover that surviving and living were two entirely different things. That same night, while Solomon slept outside on the porch and Delia's breathing settled into the slow rhythm of sleep in the corner, Theodora drew from the bottom of her trunk the one object of real value she had brought with her from the big house, a small glass inkwell and a goosequill pen wrapped in a scrap of cloth, the very pen with which she had once copied passages from books and written letters she never sent to anyone. She set it on the shelf beside the candle, looked at it for a long while, and began to write. They came for Solomon before dawn. 4 men and 3 field hands who obeyed because refusing left them nothing better to do. Solomon did not resist, not because he was afraid, but because 15 years of hard-earned understanding told him that resisting now would only cost him more later. He let them bind his wrists with a length of hemp rope and march him across the yard in the pale blue light before sunrise toward the shed at the edge of the property, where the stocks stood. Amos watched from the stable door and said nothing, because that was what fear did to a man after enough years of it. It did not take away the pain of watching injustice, only the voice to name it. Delia ran to Theodora's room and shook her awake. Child, they took him. Theodora was already awake, already upright in her chair, already holding in her hands the folded and sealed sheet of paper she had finished writing 2 hours before. I know, she said. How do you know? Because I was expecting it. Delia looked at her with those wide, dark eyes that had seen too much in this life already. "What are you going to do, child?" Theodora looked down at the letter in her hands. It was addressed to Mr. Elias Wardlaw, an attorney in Lexington who had once handled a boundary dispute for her father. Theodora had gathered from years of heard conversations at the dinner table. She was rarely invited to sit at that Wardlaw, despised Jared Combs personally, having caught the overseer padding an invoice for fence posts 3 years prior. The letter did not plead. It laid out in the precise legal language Theodora had absorbed from years of reading her father's own law books, out of sheer boredom. A description of the accusation against Solomon, the absence of any material evidence beyond the coerced word of 2 men who had every reason to lie, and most dangerously of all, a set of figures Theodora herself had copied late at night from the counting room ledgers over the past 2 weeks. Figures that did not add up. Figures that suggested the missing strongbox of silver had never left the estate at all, but had simply moved from one set of hands into another. "I need this letter to reach Lexington today," she said. "Not tomorrow. Today." "How, child? If none of us can leave the place. Pete brings the mail sack up from the Crossroads store on Thursdays. Today is Thursday. He is reliable. His mother worked in this house 20 years. He owes me nothing, but he will do it if it is put to him right. And Combs will wait at least a few days before doing anything that cannot be undone, because he wants this to look like a proper process, not a lynching. That gives us time." Delia found the boy within the hour. Theodora gave him the letter and the single silver dollar she had kept sewn into the hem of her dress since childhood, the only money she had ever owned outright, and told him plainly that if the letter did not arrive, she would know it, and so would he. For 2 days Theodora could not see Solomon at all. The shed where they held him sat at the far end of the property, and Combs had given strict orders that no one approach. Amaze told her in a low voice that they had him standing, chained, given water, but no food, awaiting whatever formal punishment Silas Webb had not yet ordered. And this was the part Theodora understood correctly. Silas wanted the whole business to look proper. Silas Webb was not a cruel man for pleasure. He was a cruel man for convenience, which was a far more dangerous kind of cruelty, because it always came dressed in the language of order and reason. Louisa Webb, Silas's second wife, a narrow-faced woman of 40 with expensive tastes and very little patience for anything that disturbed her household's calm, appeared once at the edge of the quarters. She looked at Theodora with something that was not quite pity, but the discomfort of a woman who would prefer certain problems simply did not exist. "Do you need anything?" she asked without stepping any closer. "No," Theodora said. Louisa nodded, visibly relieved, and left. Theodora did not hate her. She found her simply irrelevant, which in its own way was worse. By Thursday evening, Delia returned with news Theodora could not immediately read on her face. "The letter got there," Delia said quietly. "Messidra." Wardlaw was not in his office, but his clerk took it straight to him at his supper table. Pete said the lawyer read it twice right there at the table, and then said. Delia paused, said he would ride out first thing. Theodora closed her eyes for one single second. "Good," she said. Elias Wardlaw arrived at Hollow Grove the following morning, before the sun had cleared the tree line, on a tired bay horse. wearing a look that suggested he had slept very little and thought a great deal. He was 54 years old, broad through the middle, with a lawyer's careful eyes that missed nothing even when his face gave away almost as little as Solomon's did. He had known Silas Webb for close to 20 years, had drawn up 2 of his contracts, and settled one of his disputes. The 2 men understood each other, the way men of business often do, each aware of exactly what the other was worth and exactly what he would do to protect it. Wardlaw went directly to the house and asked to see Silas. While he waited in the parlor with its imported rug and its portrait of Silas's grandfather, no one had bothered to take down in 80 years. He read Theodora's letter again, slowly, the same careful way he had read it the night before, with the same mixture of astonishment and alarm. The reasoning was airtight, better in places than several junior attorneys he had trained himself. If even a portion of what it alleged reached the ears of the county court, not the accusation against Solomon, which mattered little to any court in Kentucky in 1852, but the plain evidence of an overseer systematically defrauding his employer, then Silas Webb's own management of his estate, and by extension his standing among the planters of Jessamine County, would be thrown open to exactly the kind of scrutiny no man in his position wanted. Silas entered with his usual air of a man who owned the world around him, and stopped short at the look on Wardlaw's face. "What is the matter with you? Sit down, Silas. Do not tell me to sit down in my own—" "Sit down," Wardlaw said again, and something in his voice made Silas do it for what may have been the first time in years. What followed was a conversation that lasted the better part of 2 hours, the exact contents of which no one outside that parlor ever heard in full, because the doors stayed shut the entire time, but whose effect was written plainly across Silas Webb's face when he finally emerged. Pale beneath his sun-darkened skin, with the look of a man who has badly miscalculated something important, and has only just understood it, he called for Combs. The conversation with Combs was shorter and considerably harsher, though it never rose to shouting. It was the particular kind of violence delivered through precise words and concrete threats. Combs left the house with his jaw set tight and his eyes carrying the color of old resentment, and walked straight to the shed. Solomon was freed before the afternoon was out. Amos and 2 other men found him with his wrists rubbed raw to the flesh underneath the rope, dehydrated but still standing, because Solomon was the kind of man who did not fall until everything in him was spent. And it was not yet spent. They brought him to the stable, gave him water and food, and Amos dressed his wrists with a poultice of herbs he had known how to prepare since he was a young man himself. Solomon did not ask how any of it had happened. He knew with the same certainty he knew the wind was about to change before it changed, by the signs, by the logic of it, by something that had no name but worked all the same, that someone had stood between him and what had been coming for him. That night, Solomon came to where Theodora sat. She was alone. Delia had gone to fetch warm water. The candle was burning low, and Theodora held her pen, but had not written anything for a long while, only stared at the flame, the way she did when she was thinking too hard. Solomon stopped in the doorway. "It was you," he said. It was not a question. Theodora looked up. She saw the white cloth wrapped around his wrists. She saw the exhaustion in his face, The first time she had ever truly seen it, because it was the first time he had allowed himself to show it. "Mr. It. Wardlaw has my letter," she said. "Our copy sits with his clerk in Lexington. If anything like this happens to you again, that letter reaches the county court within a week, and my father's troubles will be a great deal larger than either of us. Combs knows this too." Mr. Wardlaw made certain of it. "What he did was serious enough that my father could dismiss him tomorrow, if he ever needed someone to blame for something worse, and Combs is too clever a man not to understand that." A long silence. The crickets outside. The wind moving through the chinaberry trees. "Why?" Solomon asked. Theodora set down her pen. She looked directly at him. "Because it was the honest thing to do." "Why?" she repeated and paused. Not from doubt, but from care. The pause of someone choosing her words, not because she did not know what she felt, but because she knew exactly what she felt, and that gave the words weight. "Because there are very few people in my life who have ever asked me where I wanted to go." Solomon did not move from the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat on the floor across from her. Not in a chair, on the floor. Because there was no other chair in that small room besides her own. And looked at her with eyes that usually revealed nothing, and that in that moment revealed everything. "I do not have many people who ask me anything either," he said. "I know," Theodora said. Outside, Delia returned with the warm water. Saw Solomon sitting on the floor across from Theodora, the two of them silent, the candle trembling between them, and stood still in the doorway a moment, with the steaming basin in her hands. Then she turned quietly around, set the basin just outside the door so as not to disturb them, and went to sit with Amos by the stable, looking up at a sky that was that particular night unusually clear over the bluegrass. "What happened?" Amos asked. "Nothing," Delia said. "Everything." The months that followed were the strangest and most complicated Theodora had ever lived, which was saying something, because her life had never been simple. Silas ignored her with the particular efficiency of a man who has decided a problem does not exist if he refuses to look at it. He did not send for her, did not speak to her, did not ask anyone to check on her welfare. Louisa did the same. It was as though the plantation had split itself into two separate worlds, divided by an invisible wall, and Theodora had chosen, or had been chosen for the side that stood on the wrong end of that wall's architecture of power. But on the wrong end of that architecture, there were things the right end never had. There were conversations that lasted until the candle burned down to nothing. There were books passing from hand to hand, read and argued over with a quiet passion neither of them had ever been permitted to spend on anything before. There was Delia's cooking, cornbread and simmered greens, shared without the formality of a dining table Theodora had rarely been welcome at in the first place. There was Amos's talk in the evenings of the years, before Hollow Grove existed at all, when this stretch of Kentucky had belonged to the Shawnee and the Cherokee, and the rivers had run through country no fence had yet claimed. And there was Solomon's laughter, which Theodora took weeks to hear for the first time, but which, when it finally came, felt like discovering that a mountain she had thought cold all the way through had warm springs running beneath its base. It was on a rain-quiet evening in October that Theodora found the letters. She had asked Delia to bring the old trunk, she had kept locked since childhood, the one that had belonged to her mother, thinking only to find a heavier shawl against the coming cold. Instead, beneath the folded linens, her fingers found a bundle of paper tied with a faded ribbon, brittle with age, and her own name written across the top in a hand she recognized instantly, though she had not seen it in 22 years, because it was the same hand that had once guided her own small fingers over the shapes of letters in a primer long since lost. Her mother's hand. Cordelia Webb had known in the final months of her pregnancy that something about the birth troubled the midwife more than she let on. In the quiet hours, when Silas was occupied elsewhere, she had written letters to the daughter she would likely not live to raise. Letters meant to be given to Theodora when she was old enough to read them herself. Letters that Silas, grief-stricken and furious at the world in the way that some men turn their grief into cruelty, had apparently found, read, and locked away instead of ever delivering. In them, Cordelia wrote of her hopes for a daughter she already loved without having met, of her fear that her husband's disappointment, for the midwife had warned that whatever ailed the child, it might mean she never walked, would harden into something the child would carry as a wound of her own making. Do not let his coldness become your inheritance. One line read, in ink gone the color of weak tea. Whatever your legs allow or do not allow, walk toward the people who see you plainly and stay there. Theodora read every page twice by candlelight. When she finished, she did not cry. Not at first, because crying was not a habit her life had left room for. But she held the pages against her chest for a long while. When Solomon found her later that night, her face carried an expression he had not seen on her before. Something between grief and a strange hard-won relief, as though a door she had believed sealed for 2 decades had finally been found unlocked all along. Simply hidden behind furniture no one had thought to move. She showed him the letters. He read them slowly, the way he read everything. When he finished, he said only, "She sounds like she knew you before you were even born." "She did," Theodora said. "My father just never let her finish knowing me." It was that same season that Theodora learned something of Solomon's own past. A story he had never offered easily to anyone, but which came loose slowly over these long evenings, the way old knots eventually give way to patient hands. He had been 13 when he was sold south out of a small farm near Richmond. Separated in a single afternoon from his mother, a woman named Patience, whom he remembered mostly in fragments now. The particular way she hummed while she worked, the smell of wood smoke in her apron, and a small carved wooden bird, no bigger than a thumb, that she had pressed into his hand the last time he ever saw her. Whittled from a scrap of cedar with a pocket knife she was not supposed to own. He had kept that bird for 15 years, wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the one wooden box he was permitted to call his own. He had never once in all that time learned what became of her. Amos knew her, Solomon said one night, so quietly Theodora almost missed it. He was on the same coffle years before, sold off the same trading yard in Richmond before either of us ever came here. He told me once a long time ago that she had been resold to a rice plantation somewhere along the Georgia coast. He did not know more than that. I never asked him again after that because I was afraid of what asking again might cost him to remember and what it might cost me to hear. Theodora looked at the small carved bird when he finally showed it to her, turning it over in her palm, feeling the worn grooves where a mother's careful knife had shaped it decades before. "If you were ever free," she said slowly, "would you look for her?" Solomon was quiet a long time. "Every day of my life," he said, "I have thought about it. And every day of my life I have had no way to." Winter came and went, and with the spring came a new complication that neither Theodora nor Solomon had fully reckoned with. Mr. Wardlaw, who had continued to correspond quietly with Theodora through Delia, and the boy Pete over the intervening months, more out of a lawyer's professional curiosity than any expectation of further trouble, paid a visit to Hollow Grove in March. He found occasion to speak with Theodora alone on the stable porch, while Silas was away at a livestock auction in Louisville. "I want to ask you something plainly, Miss Webb," he said, "because I think you would rather hear it plain than hear it softened." "Go on." "Suppose your father someday wished to free the man Solomon. Suppose he wished it sincerely out of whatever changes a conscience or a scandal or simple old age might work in him. It would not be so simple a thing as writing a paper and handing it over." Theodora's expression did not change, but her hands tightened slightly on the arms of her chair. "Explain it to me." Wardlaw did. Kentucky law, like the law of nearly every southern state by the 1850s, had grown steadily more hostile to manumission with each passing decade, particularly since the anxieties that followed Nat Turner's uprising 2 decades before. A private manumission required at minimum the posting of a substantial bond and a public notice of intent, subject to challenge by any citizen who cared to object. In practice, many counties required legislative approval that was rarely granted. Worse, even where manumission succeeded, state law generally required the newly freed person to leave Kentucky within a fixed period, often no more than 30 days, or risk being seized and sold back into bondage on the theory. Argued in courthouse after courthouse across the South, that free black people living among the enslaved population posed a danger to the entire system. "So even if my father agreed," Theodora said slowly, "even if he signed every paper in the county, Solomon would still have to leave the state, and quickly, and likely with very little to his name beyond the clothes on his back, and whatever you could arrange to send with him. It is not freedom in any full sense most men imagine when they use the word," Wardlaw said. "It is an exit, if it is granted at all, and a narrow one." Theodora said nothing for a long while after Wardlaw rode away that afternoon. She sat on the porch as the light slanted gold across the yard. When Solomon came in from the fields at dusk and saw her face, he did not need to ask what troubled her. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything now, because plainness between them had become its own kind of tenderness. "Then it is not really freedom they would be offering," Solomon said afterward. "It is a door that only opens on to more walking." "Would you still walk through it?" Theodora asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "Only if you were walking beside me." That summer, Silas Webb fell ill. It began as an ordinary low fever, the kind that moved through the bluegrass every warm season on the back of the mosquitoes, that bred thick in the low, wet bottomland along the creeks, a fever most men shook off within a week with rest and quinine bark. Silas did not shake it off. By August he was confined to his bed. sweating through linens that Louisa's own maid changed twice a day, his breathing grown shallow and his mind in its clearer hours, turning over things he had spent 22 years refusing to look at directly. He sent for Wardlaw twice that month, not for business matters, but to sit with him in long silences that the lawyer, out of some old loyalty or simple human decency, never once refused. No one in this story received a miracle. There was no sudden vision, no deathbed transformation of a cruel man into a saint. What happened instead was smaller and more believable, the way real change in real people usually is. A man running out of time began in fits and starts to reckon honestly with a handful of the things he had done. Not because his soul had been washed clean, but because dying has a way of stripping away the vanities a man spends his whole healthy life protecting. He sent for Theodora in the second week of September. She had not set foot in the big house in over a year. Solomon wheeled her chair up the ramp Amos had quietly built at the side entrance months before without being asked, in case such a day ever came, and left her at the door of her father's room, because Silas had asked to see her alone. The room smelled of camphor and sweat, and the candle wax Louisa burned to cover both. Silas lay propped against pillows, his face gray, his once thick frame gone hollow in a matter of weeks. When he saw his daughter in the doorway, something crossed his features that Theodora had never once seen there before. Not shame exactly, because shame required a kind of honesty Silas had spent his whole life avoiding, but something adjacent to it, something closer to fear. "You came," he said. "You asked." He gestured weakly at the chair beside the bed, and Theodora wheeled herself to it. For a long while, neither of them spoke. A mockingbird worked through its evening repertoire in the magnolia tree beside the window, indifferent to what was happening inside. "I have had Wardlaw draw up papers," Silas said finally, his voice thin. "For the man Solomon." Theodora went very still. "What kind of papers?" "Manumission. With the bond posted and the notice filed. All of it done proper, so no fool in this county can challenge it after I am gone." He paused to breathe, the effort visible. "He will have to leave the state. Wardlaw told you that already. I expect he has. There is land," Silas went on. "A parcel I hold free and clear up in Pennsylvania, across from Wheeling, bought years ago on a speculation that never paid off the way I hoped. 40 acres, a cabin on it, nothing grand. It is yours now in the will, along with enough money to see the two of you settled there, and Solomon's freedom papers, filed the moment he crosses into free ground." He stopped, and something that might have been the ghost of an old, buried tenderness moved across his ruined face. "Your mother would have wanted you settled somewhere kinder than this house ever was." Theodora felt something crack open in her chest that she had kept sealed since she was 9 years old. "Why now?" she asked, and her voice, for the first time in longer than she could remember, was not entirely steady. Silas looked at the ceiling for a long while before he answered. "Because I am out of time to keep pretending I do not know what I did," he said. "I do not ask you to forgive it. I only ask you to take what I can still give while I can still give it." Silas Webb died 11 days later in the last cool week of September, the fever finally winning the long argument it had been having with his body. There was no final absolution, no tearful reconciliation played out for an audience, only a quiet passing in a darkened room with Louisa at his side and the mockingbird. By strange coincidence, silent for once in the magnolia outside, Hollow Grove observed a period of somber formality that lasted exactly as long as such things were expected to last among planter families. Then Wardlaw came to read the will. The bequest to Theodora stood unchallenged, in part because Louisa, whatever her faults, had no appetite for a public court battle that would drag her late husband's private failures into the Lexington papers, and in part because Wardlaw himself, with the quiet thoroughness of a man who had drafted the papers to be unbreakable from the start, had left no seam for a challenge to find purchase in. Amaze was the one who finally answered the question that had lived unspoken in Solomon's chest for 15 years. In the weeks before their departure, as word spread of Solomon's coming freedom, an old man from a neighboring plantation, hearing the story secondhand through the slow grapevine that ran between the quarters of every farm in the county, sent word through a Sunday preacher that he had once, many years before, worked a rice plantation on the Georgia coast alongside a woman named Patience, a woman who used to hum while she worked, and who had spoken often in her last years of a boy she had been forced to leave behind in Kentucky. She had died of a lung fever some 6 years past, the old man said, but she had died believing her son was still alive somewhere, still strong, still carrying whatever she had managed to give him before the wagon pulled away. It was not the reunion Solomon had spent 15 years hoping for in his most private moments. But it was an answer at last, after 15 years of none. Theodora watched him sit very still with the small carved wooden bird cupped in both his enormous hands for the better part of an hour, grieving a woman he had not seen since he was a boy, but grieving her finally with the certainty of knowing rather than the ache of wondering. The weeks that followed the reading of the will were unlike anything Hollow Grove had seen in Theodora's lifetime. Louisa, eager to see the whole uncomfortable business concluded, and the estate settled into whatever new shape it would take under a court, appointed administrator until the younger Webb cousins came of age to claim their portions, raised no objection to the timeline Wardlaw proposed. Within a month the manumission papers had been filed, witnessed, and bonded exactly as Kentucky law required, down to the last clause. Wardlaw himself rode out to Hollow Grove to deliver the documents in person. Unwilling, he said, to trust something this important to any hand but his own, he found Solomon in the yard splitting fence rails, with the same unhurried strength he brought to every task, and called him over. Solomon set down the axe, wiped his palms on his trousers, and approached with the same careful stillness he had carried since the very first day Theodora had known him. Wardlaw handed him a folded sheath of paper sealed in wax, heavier in the hand than its size suggested. "These say you are a free man," Wardlaw said. "The moment you cross into Pennsylvania, Kentucky law will not recognize your freedom while you remain inside its borders, no matter what this paper says. So you will want to keep it close and keep moving until the Ohio River is behind you. There is a steamboat captain out of Louisville, a man named Chalmers, who has carried freedom papers north before, without asking questions he did not need answered. I have already written ahead." Solomon turned the papers over in his hands, the same hands that had once carried timber beams that would have broken lesser men. For a long moment he said, "Nothing at all." Then he looked up. 15 years, he said. And it comes down to a folded piece of paper and a boat captain who is willing to look the other way. That is the ugly truth of it, Wardlaw admitted. It is not the freedom a just world would owe a man. It is the freedom this one is willing to allow, which is a smaller and meaner thing. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. I am not insulted, Solomon said quietly. I am just remembering every year I spent believing this piece of paper would never exist at all. That evening, Theodora found him sitting on the same porch step, where he had once read stitched pamphlets by candlelight in secret. The freedom papers resting on his knee, his eyes fixed on the darkening tree line beyond the fields. She wheeled herself close and sat with him in silence for a long while, listening to the last of the season's crickets and the far-off call of a whippoorwill somewhere down toward the creek bottom. "Are you frightened?" she asked finally. "Some," Solomon admitted. "Not of the leaving. Of believing it is real before it is finished being real. I have watched men here believe things were settled before, only to have it all taken back at the last hour by somebody with more power and less conscience than they had." "It will not be taken back," Theodora said. "I intend to make certain of that, with every breath I have left to spend on it." Solomon turned to look at her, and in the fading light, something in his carefully guarded face finally came all the way open, the way a door left unlocked for years finally swings wide once someone thinks to push it. "I know you will," he said. "That is the thing I have come to trust most in this whole world. Not the paper." The final days at Hollow Grove were spent in the quiet, practical business of leaving a life behind. Delia wept more than either Theodora or Solomon did combined, insisting through her tears that she was only crying from happiness, though everyone in the small room understood it was a good deal more complicated than that. Happiness tangled up with an old woman's grief at watching the child she had raised from infancy prepare to travel 1,000 miles away toward a future Delia herself, still enslaved, still bound to whatever fate the estate's administrator decided for her, would never get to share. Theodora spent 3 long nights writing letters to Wardlaw regarding the small remaining details of the estate, to a Pennsylvania acquaintance of her mother's family who had decades before married into a Pittsburgh household and might offer some early guidance in a country neither Theodora nor Solomon had ever seen with their own eyes. And finally, a letter to Delia herself, promising that the moment circumstances allowed it, she would find a way to purchase her freedom, too, and bring her north to the house on the 40 acres across from Wheeling. A promise Theodora intended to keep with the same stubborn precision she brought to everything else in her life. Amaze was the hardest farewell of all in its own quiet way, because Amaze had never been a man given to displays of feeling. Yet on the last morning, as the wagon that would carry them to the Louisville road stood loaded and waiting in the gray pre-dawn light, he pressed something small into Solomon's palm. A second carving, this one freshly whittled from a scrap of cedar, roughly shaped into the same small bird Patience had made so many years before. "Saw the first one once a long while back when you were still young enough to show it to folks without fear," Amaze said. "Thought you ought to carry a matched pair north in case one gets lost along the way." A man ought to have more than one thing left of his mother, if the world is finally going to let him keep anything at all. Solomon could not speak for a long moment. He simply closed his hand around the small carved shape and pulled the old man into an embrace that lasted longer than either of them likely intended. Two men who had shared 15 years of the same hard ground, saying goodbye in the only language either of them fully trusted. The road to Louisville took the better part of 5 days. The wagon rattled south and west along rutted clay tracks that cut through hardwood forests and creek bottoms, past small crossroads towns where the sight of a free man's papers being checked was common enough that no one gave the wagon a second glance, and past larger towns where Wardlaw's careful instructions, travel by day, keep the papers on your person at all times, let Theodora do the talking whenever a white stranger demanded an explanation, because a crippled planter's daughter drew far less suspicion than a giant of a black man traveling alone, proved their worth again and again. The landscape itself seemed to soften the farther south they traveled. The tight tobacco rows, giving way to looser stands of oak and hickory, the air growing thick and briny as they approached the Ohio River. On the 5th evening they crested a low rise and saw, spread out below them, in the dying orange light, the wide gray ribbon of the Ohio, and the masts of a dozen steamboats crowded along the Louisville wharves like a leafless winter forest. It was outside a crossroads store 2 days into the journey, in a stretch of country where the land grew swampy and close and the road narrowed between walls of dark water Tupelo, that the troubled Wardlaw had warned them of finally found them. 4 mounted men, part of the county's slave patrol, rode out from behind a bend in the road with the unhurried proprietary air of men accustomed to stopping whoever they pleased. The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a tobacco-stained beard, drew his horse across the wagon track and held up a hand. "Where is this one bound, and on whose authority?" the man asked, his eyes moving over Solomon with the particular flat assessment of someone pricing livestock. Theodora did not hesitate because she had rehearsed this exact moment in her mind a dozen times on the ride south, turning her voice into the same flat, unbothered instrument of authority she had heard her father use her entire life. "He belongs to my late father's estate, and he is under my authority now, carrying my trunks to Louisville for passage north on family business. I would thank you not to delay us further than you already have, sir, as I have a boat to catch and very little patience left for further delay on this road." The patrol leader's eyes flicked to her chair, to her fine if travel-worn dress, to the unmistakable bearing of a planter's daughter who expected to be obeyed, and something in his posture eased, though not entirely. "Papers," he said anyway, holding out his hand toward Solomon rather than her. This was the moment Wardlaw had warned them of most gravely. The moment when the freedom papers, meant to protect Solomon the instant he crossed into free territory, would instead condemn him the instant a suspicious patrolman read them, while still standing on Kentucky soil, where the law recognized no such freedom at all. Solomon reached instead into an inner pocket and produced a different document, one Wardlaw had drawn up for precisely this contingency. A bill of conveyance describing Solomon as property being transported under Theodora's authority, as heir to a specific bequest under her father's will on business connected to the Pennsylvania land, holdings left to her outright, complete with Wardlaw's own notarized seal. The patrolman squinted at the document for a long moment, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the legal language. Theodora held her breath, without letting a single trace of it show on her face, because she had learned over this past year exactly how to hold terror in the same locked room where she had once buried grief. Finally, the man grunted, folded the paper, and handed it back. "Mind you do not dawdle in this country after dark," he said. "Patrol does not answer for what happens to property left unattended on the road at night." He wheeled his horse aside, and the other three followed. The wagon rolled on into the Tupelo shadows, while Theodora's hands, still folded neatly in her lap, trembled with an intensity she did not allow her voice to betray, until the riders were well out of sight and hearing. "That was close," she said finally when the road had been empty a full quarter hour. "Closer than I would like to know," Solomon said. For the first time in the whole journey, Theodora heard something shake loose in his voice, too. The fear he had been carrying silently the entire ride finally permitted a single breath of open air. "You did that like you had done it 100 times. I have spent 22 years learning how to sound like I am not afraid of anything," Theodora said. "First time it has ever actually been useful for something worth being afraid of." They reached Louisville on the 5th evening, and the city itself struck both of them with particular disorientation of people who had spent their whole lives inside the narrow boundaries of a single plantation, suddenly confronted with the noise and reach of a real river port. The shouting of stevedores loading tobacco and hemp onto steamboats bound for Pittsburgh and New Orleans, the smell of coal smoke and river water and rotting fish along the wharves, the strange spectacle of free black sailors moving about the docks with an ease neither Solomon nor Theodora had ever witnessed in a black man before, unremarked upon, unwatched, simply going about their business the way any working man goes about his. Captain Chalmers's steamboat, the Delta Belle, sat low and long against the wharf, her twin stacks already trailing thin gray smoke in preparation for the morning tide. The captain himself, a lean, weathered man with a New England accent gone soft from 20 years, trading along the western rivers, met them at the gangplank with Wardlaw's letter already in hand. "Lawyer Wardlaw speaks well of you both," Chalmers said, looking Solomon over with none of the patrol leader's suspicion, only the practical appraisal of a man who had smuggled more than one soul north on the strength of a letter and a private conscience. "We will run down to the Mississippi and follow her all the way past Cairo and catch the Ohio from there. 10 days, maybe 12, if the weather holds. You will bunk below with the cargo the first stretch, Solomon, until we are past the country where anybody is like to come asking questions. Once we are up past Cincinnati, you can come up and breathe the air like a man who owns his own lungs, because by then, close enough to the truth of it, you will." The 10 days that followed passed in a strange, suspended quality of time neither of them had words for. The wide brown rivers unspooling beneath the paddle wheel, the country changing by degrees so gradual it was almost impossible to name the moment one world ended and another began. Tobacco fields giving way to corn, corn giving way to open pasture. The accents of the deckhands softening and shifting the farther north the boat pushed. Solomon spent the early days below, as Chalmers had instructed, sharing a narrow berth among tobacco bales and barrels of molasses, emerging only after dark to walk the deck in the cooling air and stand beside Theodora's chair, which the crew had rigged with rope and canvas to keep steady against the boat's gentle roll, while she read to him from the one book of poetry she had managed to bring, her voice low against the churn of the paddle wheel and the dark water sliding past. It was on the 11th night, somewhere above Cincinnati, that Chalmers himself came to find them at the rail, a rare smile cracking his weathered face. "Pennsylvania line is just ahead," he said. "Cross that line, son, and there is no piece of paper in Kentucky that means a blessed thing to your situation anymore. You will be standing on free ground, same as any man born to it." Solomon said nothing for a long moment, watching the dark water ahead, where somewhere unseen in the night one river met another, and one country of law gave way to a different one entirely. Theodora reached up and took his hand, and he held hers the way he had held it that first afternoon in the yard so long ago. Only now there was nothing tentative in it at all. They crossed a little after midnight, the boat's bell ringing some small private ceremony of its own devising as the pilot called the change of water beneath the hull. Solomon stood at the rail with the two small carved birds cupped together in his free hand, and did not cry, because 15 years of surviving had taught him, much as it had taught Theodora, to save his tears for something other than the moment itself. But something in his shoulders, some tension carried since he was 13 years old, and torn from a woman who hummed while she worked, finally visibly let go. The 40 acres Sila's web had left them sat on a low rise above the Ohio River, a few miles east of Wheeling, in country that looked nothing at all like the flat green tobacco fields of Jessamine County. Here the land rolled in gentle hills, thick with oak and hickory, already gone gold and bare in the deepening autumn air. The cabin standing at the center of the property, though small and long neglected, had good bones, a solid stone chimney, a sound roof needing only minor repair, and a well that Chalmers's own hired man, sent along to help them settle, pronounced sweet and clean after a single taste. They arrived on a bright cold morning, the wagon that had carried them up from the river, landing creaking to a stop in the overgrown dooryard. For a long moment neither of them moved, simply sitting and looking at the small stone chimney and the tangle of goldenrod grown up around the doorstep at a piece of ground that belonged in the plain eyes of the law of that state to both of them equally, in whatever fashion a woman and a free man could hold land together in 1853. "It is not much to look at," Theodora said finally. "It is the first ground I have ever stood on that was not somebody else's to give or take away." Solomon said, "It could be half a swamp, and I would still call it the finest place I have ever seen." The first weeks were spent in the unglamorous business of making a ruined cabin livable again, patching the roof, clearing the chimney of a season's worth of birds' nests, turning the small kitchen garden that had gone to weed since whatever tenant farmer had last worked the place years before. Word traveled quickly in the small free, black community that had grown up along that stretch of the Pennsylvania side of the river. Many of its members formerly enslaved themselves, or the children of those who had crossed the same water by less comfortable means than a steamboat cabin. Within the first month, Solomon had found steady work at a sawmill run by a free black man named Obadiah Fenwick, whose family had purchased its freedom generations before in Virginia. Fenwick took one look at Solomon's shoulders and hired him on the spot, without asking a single question about where he had come from. Delia's freedom took longer to arrange than Theodora had hoped, tangled up as it was in the slow machinery of the estate's administration back in Kentucky. But Wardlaw, true to the quiet decency he had shown throughout the whole affair, pressed the matter patiently on Theodora's behalf. By the following spring a letter arrived confirming that Delia's own manumission had been filed and bonded, and that she would be traveling north herself as soon as the rivers opened again after the winter ice. This time not smuggled in secrecy, but carried openly as a free woman with her own papers folded safe in her own hand. Amos did not live to make the same journey. Word reached them later that same year, through the same slow grapevine that had once carried news of patients across 2 states, that he had died quietly in his sleep back in February, in the same small room by the stable where he had spent the last years of his own long, unfree life. Theodora wept for him with a freedom of grief she had never once permitted herself for anyone, while she still lived under her father's roof. The marriage took place on a Sunday in late June, in the small Methodist church that served the free black community along that stretch of river. The service was performed by a minister who had himself been born enslaved in Kentucky and freed by his own hands, labor 20 years before, in a ceremony witnessed by Obadiah Fenwick and his wife, by 2 of Solomon's new co-workers from the sawmill, and by Delia, who had arrived from Kentucky only 3 weeks prior and cried through the entire brief service in a manner she once again insisted through her tears was purely from happiness. By the time the first snow fell on their second winter, on the Pennsylvania hillside, the cabin no longer looked like the sagging, forgotten thing it had been the morning they first arrived. Solomon had rebuilt the porch with his own hands in the long evenings, after his shifts at Fenwick's sawmill, widening the doorway and laying a smooth plank ramp beside the front steps, so that Theodora could come and go from her own home without needing to be carried over a single threshold that had not been built with her in mind. A small act of construction that meant more to her, she told him once, than any grand gesture ever could have. Delia had taken over the kitchen entirely within a week of her arrival, declaring the previous arrangement of pots and shelves an offense against good sense. She had planted before the first frost a stretch of turnip greens and winter squash that reminded her, she said, of a garden her own mother had kept somewhere she could no longer clearly picture, back before she herself had been carried away from it as a girl. Theodora spent those early years doing something she had never once been permitted to do in her father's house. She taught. Word spread through the small free black settlement that the crippled white woman up on the ridge could read faster than any schoolmaster in 3 counties, and was willing to sit for hours with anyone, young or old, who wanted the same key that had once unlocked so much for her in a life that had offered her precious little else. Children came first, sent by parents eager for them to have what the law of Kentucky had once made a crime to give. Then slowly grown men and women came too, Some of them former field hands who had crossed the river the same hard way Solomon once had. They sat at Theodora's kitchen table in the evening light with a primer open between them, forming letters with the same fierce, patient concentration she remembered seeing on Solomon's own face the very first night she had caught him reading by candlelight on a porch 1,000 miles south of where she now sat. Solomon, for his part, never stopped looking for word of anyone else he had once known at Hollow Grove. He wrote careful letters through Wardlaw and through the slow, patient network of free black correspondence that ran up and down the rivers of that era, checking on the fates of men and women he had grown up beside. Some of them, years later, found their own ways north through purchase or flight or the slow erosion of an estate too large for a single distracted hair to manage. He never did find another trace of the family he had been born into before Richmond, before the coffle, before the 13 years of his life that existed, now only as fragments too old and too faint to fully recover. But he kept the 2 small carved birds on the windowsill of the cabin's front room for the rest of his life. One made by a mother he had lost too young to fully remember her face, and one made by an old man who had loved him enough in his own quiet way to make sure he never crossed into freedom, carrying nothing of where he had come from. Word reached them some 3 years after they had settled on the ridge that Hollow Grove itself had passed out of Webb hands entirely, sold at auction to settle debts that Silas, for all his careful ledgers, had apparently hidden even from himself in his final years. Debts that Jared Combs never dismissed after all, only warned, because Silas had never quite found the will to admit how badly he had misjudged the man, had spent the years since quietly deepening. Louisa moved to Louisville to live with her sister, and was never heard from again in any letter that reached the cabin on the ridge. Theodora received the news with less feeling than she might once have expected of herself, the way a person receives word of a distant country's weather, true and once significant, but no longer anything that reached far enough to touch the life she had actually built. What did reach her, and what she carried for the rest of her days, with an entirely different weight, was a letter that arrived in the spring of their 4th year on the ridge. In a careful, unpracticed hand she recognized before she had even broken the seal, because she had taught that hand its very first letters herself at her own kitchen table only that past winter. It was from a young woman named Cassie, one of Theodora's students, who had crossed the river alone the previous autumn after buying her own freedom with money saved over 11 years of hired-out labor. Cassie wrote now in halting but determined sentences to say that she had found steady work as a seamstress in Pittsburgh proper, had joined a church choir, and had, for the first time in her whole life, signed her own name to a lease with her own hand. I would not have known how to make these letters mean anything, the young woman wrote, if you had not sat with me those long evenings and shown me that they could. Theodora read that letter to Solomon by the fire that night, her voice catching only once at the final line. When she finished, he reached over and took her hand the way he had taken it that first afternoon so many years before, in a yard beneath a Kentucky sun that had shown neither of them any mercy at all, and said nothing. By then, after everything the 2 of them had carried together, there were some things that no longer required saying out loud to be understood completely. They raised 2 children on that ridge above the river. A daughter who grew up strong, legged and quick, running the same hillside paths her mother had never once been able to walk herself, and a son who inherited his father's enormous quiet stillness, and, to Theodora's private delight, her own stubborn love of books. Delia lived to see both children grown nearly to adulthood before she passed peacefully in the same small back room she had chosen for herself the day she arrived, insisting to the end that it suited her fine and that she had no need of anything grander. After a lifetime of making do with far less, Solomon never forgot the sound of his own name being called across that Kentucky yard on the worst afternoon of his life. The moment a man who owned him tried to hand him another human being the way he might hand over a length of rope or a sack of seed corn, intending only cruelty, understanding nothing at all of what he was actually setting into motion, he kept that memory the way he kept the 2 small carved birds. Not to nurse the old wound, but because a man who has survived what he survived owes it to himself, he said once late in his life, sitting on the same porch he had built with his own hands, to remember exactly how far the road had run from that yard to this one, so that he never once mistook the ground he was finally standing on for anything other than what it was. Hard-won and entirely finally his own. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a household once the worst has already happened and been survived. It was that quiet Theodora noticed most in the years that followed. The simple absence of dread from her days. She had spent 22 years learning to hold her body still against a world that expected nothing from her but patience. She spent the rest of her life learning something far harder and far better: how to want things out loud, how to ask for them, how to build a household where wanting was not a weakness to be hidden, but the plainest, most ordinary business of living. Solomon, for his part, discovered in freedom a version of himself he had never been permitted to meet before. A man who could choose which hours belonged to labor and which belonged to rest. Who could walk to the river on a Sunday afternoon simply because he wished to see the water moving. Who could sit at his own table and eat a meal he had grown himself, cooked in a kitchen he owned, beside a wife who had once been given to him as an insult, and who had, by the plain daily accumulation of 1,000 small choices, neither of them had been taught to expect, become instead the truest thing in his life. Neither of them ever spoke of that yard in Jessamine County as though it were the beginning of their story. It was simply the place a much older, much crueler world had tried and failed to write the last page of a story that, as it turned out, had barely begun. On that Pennsylvania ridge, seasons after a plantation owner had tried to discard the 2 people he valued least in this world by binding them together as one final act of cruelty. Those same 2 people sat together most evenings on a porch of Solomon's own building, hands joined, a fire warm in the small stone hearth behind them, and a future that belonged at long last, and against every design that had once been made for them, entirely to themselves.